Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar. You have stepped into a course that is going to change the way that you look at data. Not just how you analyze it, but also how you communicate it. My name is Nivid Desai. I serve as the Program Executive at Writing Studio IIT Gandhinagar. Welcome to Writing for Data Science. This course is at the intersection of analysis and communication. As all of us know, data analysis is not just about coding and models. It is about solving real-world problems. And that is exactly why every single thought that goes into solving those problems needs to be communicated. And not just to one audience, across multiple stakeholders. That is where this course comes in. This course prepares you with the foundations of writing, especially curated for data science. We will discuss audience analysis, critical thinking, logical reasoning, as well as storytelling that is native to data science. So join me on a journey at the intersection of numbers and narratives. I'll see you in class. Namaste, hello and welcome to Writing for Data Science. My name is Nivid Desai and we are on a journey to explore the interesting intersections between numbers and narratives. Today is part 2 of our trilogy, the Synthesis series. Before we end this course, we are looking back at everything that we studied and we are investigating how those points talk to each other. How these modules are interconnected by a chain of causality. In this journey, in the past lecture, we discussed how the first module, Introduction to Writing for Data Science, and the second module, Audience Analysis, were interlinked. For today's lecture, we are going to look at the second module again, Audience Analysis, but this time around with connections to the third module, Critical Thinking and Logical Reasoning. So, let's start exploring these connections. Where do audience analysis and critical thinking and logical reasoning start talking to each other? Well, first and foremost, we are reasoning, we are thinking for someone, right? None of that is in isolation. Critical thinking helps you ask good questions. They test assumptions and they avoid any kind of fallacies. While audience analysis helps you decide which questions matter and how conclusions should be framed. Together, both of these values ensure that your reasoning is not just correct but useful. It actually ends up shaping policy and decisions. With that background, let's reflect on this question. Have you ever made a logically sound point that still failed to convince someone? Why do you think that? Why do you think that happened? What could you have done better? Think about it. Let's look at some more intersections. Logical rigor, you see, is universal. Every civilization, every country, every readership expects the same kind of logical rigor. But what needs to be proven depends on the audience. Technical audiences expect detailed premises, methods, and limitations, while non technical audiences they expect clear causes, implications, and next steps. Here's how both of these components are causally linked. You see, audience expectations help you determine the level of detail that you will present, and subsequently, you will be able to determine the reasoning structure that you will use. We've explored many of them, if you remember, in our lectures in depth about logical reasoning and critical thinking. But if you don't have any idea about who your audience is, it becomes difficult to determine which one to use. That obviously raises the next question. What even is good reasoning? You see, good reasoning also changes from audience to audience. Let's see with an example. Let's assume a traffic optimization study in Pune. The engineers who were involved in this study, they would have reviewed model assumptions and error bounds, while city officials, they focused on reduced commute times and pilot outcomes. You see that the logic is the same, but the emphasis is different. Each of these are matched to the audience. Here's a quick exercise for you. State one claim about a dataset. What extra reasoning would a technical audience demand? Think about what a technical audience prefers, prioritizes, and wants out of a report. If you are making that claim about a dataset, what kind of extra reasoning would you need to offer to a technical audience? Moving on, we must also examine the role of audience analysis in helping us prevent logical fallacies. We've explored what those logical fallacies are in our module on critical thinking and logical reasoning. You see, many fallacies arise when writers overstate claims to persuade quickly. Audience analysis encourages careful phrasing. I understand that many of you would be in situations someday or the other when you want to turn around an audience's opinion quickly. But that is the slippery slope. that is when we start taking the audience's belief for granted and end up making grave errors in our logic. You see, there is a causality involved. Audience pressure builds the risk of fallacies, and that is why there is a need for cautious reasoning. Let's see this with an example. A renewable energy report in Rajasthan avoided this caused that kind of claims. Of course, it would have been convenient, but it would have fallen into the logical fallacy of confusing correlation with causation. So, it used language like is associated with and explained alternative factors. It took the confounding variables into account just to make sure that in the haste of convincing an audience, it doesn't let go of the rigor of logic. Stakeholders trusted the analysis and they supported the expansion just because it was authentic enough to take all the factors into account. Here's a question worth reflecting on. Which fallacy are you most tempted to commit when persuading a busy audience? Imagine a room that you need to convert immediately. What kind of fallacies would you likely commit just because you're running short of time? Refer to your notes about logical fallacies, jog your memory, and see where we are most likely to falter. Critical reasoning uses claims, evidence, and warrants as we studied. Audience analysis determines how explicit each of them must be. We have studied in depth what each of these words mean and what roles do they play in our data communication. For example, technical readers, they want explicit warrants. Decision makers want concise warrants that are tied to outcomes. So, as the audience shifts, as the priorities shift, your emphasis on all three different components claim, evidence, and warrant will also start shifting. Causally, the stakeholder concerns will lead to warrant clarity, and warrant clarity will lead to persuasive strength of your argument. Let's look at an example. Let's look at an example. Let's imagine an education analytics brief in Tamil Nadu. Let's assume that the analysts saw cohort comparisons and confidence intervals, and the administrators saw what improved and why in 3 bullet points. That was the data point that they prioritized because That was the concern that they were looking for to be addressed in that communication. The reasoning stayed intact, but the presentation changed. That is where the dynamism of communication comes in. So I have this little exercise for you to do as well. Write one warrant twice, once for a technical audience and once for a non-technical audience. Let's see if we remember the principles that we studied in that much depth. Critical thinking recognizes uncertainty. Audience analysis guides how to communicate it without losing the trust. Every time that we think critically, we need to take multiple factors into account, and all those factors may not be in our control. So, we need to leave room for uncertainty. However, all the audiences that we are addressing may respond differently to this uncertainty being present. So, we need to make sure that we communicate that uncertainty without losing the trust of our audience. So, there is a severe need for us to recognize what is the risk tolerance of the audience. How much are they willing to suspend their belief and see where your data leads? Once you understand that, you can frame the uncertainty that surrounds critical thinking. If you are authentic and honest about it, it will end up increasing and enhancing your credibility. Let's take an example of responsible logical communication. Let's assume that a crop yield forecast in Andhra Pradesh presented ranges and scenarios to farmers, paired with practical advice. So, once again, if a range is involved, if scenarios are involved, there are probably assumptions of uncertainty. Data scientists are theorizing. They are not certain about the claims that they would make. So, you prepare for contingency. You prepare for any kind of uncertainty that is going to come your way. That, in fact, does not weaken your report, it strengthens it. So, if the uncertainty is acknowledged, it can be acted upon. Every time that there is a scenario that leaves room for uncertainty, it makes it that much easier to address it when the time is right. Let's look at a reflection question. How can you show uncertainty while still enabling action? It's an interesting trade off, to be honest. Sometimes uncertainty scares us. Sometimes uncertainty pushes us to just stay still and not act. But in this case, it's an interesting trade off to examine between uncertainty and enabling action thanks to your data communication. Think about it. How will you look at uncertainty and its counterbalance of enabling action? You see, critical thinking ensures that your reasoning is sound. Audience analysis ensures that your reasoning lands. Together, they form a loop. Audience questions sharpen reasoning, and sound reasoning earns the trust of your audience. Reasoning convinces when it is built for the mind that receives it, because that is where cases are made or broken. If the audience is convinced, you have made sure that your reasoning is not just robust, but it is also resourceful. So that was it from my side for the second lecture of the synthesis series. We looked at the conversations between audience analysis and critical thinking and logical reasoning. We reached a synthesis where we saw how these two core values, an entire module that we've spent exploring these two core values, how are they interconnected with each other? How are they tied with causality? And what role do they play in our design of data communication? In the next lecture, which will be the last of this trilogy before we close the course, I will be sharing some winding up, some closing thoughts on this course. And then the last lecture of this course will be about the impact of storytelling that we have been discussing in this entire module. I just thought it was worthy that we spend some time to recall everything that we have learnt and see how it is connected before we bring this course to an end. So, coming up, next lecture, the last lecture of the synthesis series, closing thoughts. Until then, stay curious, keep learning. All the best. Thank you so much for joining me today. Namaskar.